Good morning. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I am so excited to have Mark Manzo, one of our real estate utility experts here at ODOT, this morning for you on the webinar. Mark is going to be presenting on utility reimbursement for local public agencies. We do have everybody in listen-only mode, but we would encourage you to put any questions that you have in the question area of the GoToWebinar box. And Mark will be happy to address those questions at the end of the presentation. Also, we'll follow up with a written form of the questions and answers after the webinar has completed. We are attempting to record the webinar, but please don't let that dampen your enthusiasm for asking questions, because if you have a question, I am certain that at least one other person has the same question, and we want to make sure that this is an event where you're able to get your questions answered. Now, Mark has shared with me that he has quite a bit of information for you today, so there's a chance we might run a little over that hour. If we do, and you need to go, you're of course welcome to go at any time, but if you have time, you can hang on to be able to complete the webinar out. That would be great. And any questions that come into the box during the presentation, I'll read those off to Mark when we get to the end so he can provide you some responses to that. So I believe that's all the housekeeping items I had. Mark, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Victoria. Welcome to the webinar today on the utility reimbursements for local public agencies. I do want to say up front first that within this presentation, you're going to see the word ODOT and LPA, and in essence, a lot of this information that I'm going to be presenting is coming out of the ODOT utility manual. So whether it's ODOT or LPA that you hear, it basically is referencing the same. So that being said, let's go ahead and start the presentation. The basis for this on how the utilities are being the reimbursement law is based on the ORC 5501.51. And that's reimbursing utilities for facilities relocated by a highway project. Now, you can see it's not very much of a very big law there, but what is most important is what's basically within this paragraph A here. And in essence, the state shall reimburse a utility for the cost of relocation of utility facilities necessitated by the construction of a highway project only in the event that the utility can evidence a vested interest in the nature of a fee interest, an easement interest, or a lesser estate in the real property it occupies, in the event that the utility possesses a vested interest in such property. Now, I gotta be honest with you, that's a lot of words put together. And so based on that, that is the heart and soul of what the utility reimbursement is about. So based on that, the question then comes, how does ODOT determine utility eligibility or reimbursement eligibility? Well, the eligibility is based on two conditions. First condition is the existing utility facilities must be affected by the project limits, and I highlight that. And that's based on any facilities that are removed, relocated, replaced, and based on the tie-in of where this is done. And the second condition, it's an and, the utility must have a compensable interest in the location of their existing facilities. So based on that, what does compensable interest mean? Well, when you look at it, there are those utilities that are private or publicly held utilities. Now, just to kind of give you an understanding, a private utility is a utility whose ownership and operation is under the control and direction of a private individual, company, or corporation. Utilities such as a farmer's water line or an industrial plant's pipeline, those are considered private utilities. A publicly held utility is a utility whose ownership and operation is under the control and direction of private sector officials and public stockholders and regulated by the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Now, these type of utilities are those that you find in your home, like your electric company, your gas company, your communication company, cable company. These are considered publicly held utilities. So based on that, the compensable interest for a private or publicly held utilities are based on property owned by the utility. In other words, the utility owns the property in fee simple. On private property where the utility has a valid easement. Now, this is typically how utilities, public and privately held utilities, will be reimbursed. That's basically the majority of them. They own an easement, and this easement is been acquired from the property owner. And based on that, this easement is outside the road right-of-way. The third condition is on private property where the utility has a valid prescriptive right. Now, you don't usually see this that often, but it is an actual compensable interest that some utilities can claim. And that is based on, as long as the claim of reimbursement is based on statutory requirements for Ohio, and then they are met. In other words, the time period is 21 years or greater of continuous use and occupancy of the property. The occupancy must be open and notorious, meaning there's no record of written or verbal agreement with the property owner, and that the utility records reflect no evidence of an easement having been granted. So based on those conditions, if the utility meets those conditions, then they have a compensable interest. Now, keep in mind, any service pole can be fit that description, but those are not eligible. And the reason being is that there is a service agreement between the utility and the property owner, which the open and notorious part cannot meet. So that's why I say it's a very seldomly used, but it is a property right or a compensable interest that for some utilities to claim for. And the last thing is on public road right-of-way where the utility has a valid easement that predates the rights held by the state. There are situations where, if a utility is on private property in an easement, and then over the course of time, the government agency continues to expand their road right-of-way, which in essence may even overlap the utility's easement. If the utility chooses to stay in that easement, they can. And in essence, at this point, their easement predates the government agency, proposed right-of-way. That being the case, if by chance the utility has to move because the road expands again, then all rights for them, to be reimbursed would not only be for their facilities, but even the acquiring of a new easement as well. So those are the four compensable interests for private or publicly held utilities. The other reimbursement is for public utilities. And a public utility is an easement, or is a utility, whose ownership and operation is under the control and direction of the elected public body. These are utilities that the county or municipalities, such as villages and cities, own and operate. And what we're talking about here is like a water line or a sanitary sewer line. So based on that, on property owned by the government agency, and again, we're talking about, it's similar to the publicly or the private and publicly held utility. It's owned by the government agency. It's a fee simple. They don't need an easement because they own the property. And if they have facilities on that property that are affected by a project, that would be their compensable interest. The second one is on public road right-of-way where the public utility has a valid easement. And again, when a public utility steps outside their, let's say, city corporation limits, they acquire an easement from a property owner, then that is a private easement outside. And that's no different than when a utility acquires a property, an easement from a property owner. So that's the second compensable interest for public utilities that are used. The third is on public road right-of-way within the corporation limits of the county or municipality that operates and owns the public utility. So if a city, let's say, has a project, and within the city they have their own water department, and this project that is going on for the city affects the water line that's already in the city's road right of way, then that in and of itself gives the right to go ahead and reimburse the city for the water line to be relocated. Now, typically, this type of work is performed as part of the highway construction plan, not on a forced account basis. So it would be coded in the plans in the general summary as 100% or whatever was determined to be eligible. And the last compensable interest would be on public road right-of-way outside the corporations of the municipality where the utility has a compensable agreement with the government agency having jurisdiction. So again, what this is saying is if you have a water line that City A is supplying to City B, and City B, and in this agreement, it basically says that, City B will be responsible for if the road widens to go ahead and pay for the water line to be relocated. Well, then, if the project is affecting City B, then that water line that's being used there in City B would be in an eligible position for reimbursement. So these are the type of scenario cases that we look for when reimbursing public utilities. So when we look at early utility involvement along the project development process, there are certain things that are, very important to look at. Frequent utility involvement in the planning and design phases of the highway project development process is critical in order to effectively coordinate design requirements based on federal, state, and local standards. The Stage 1 review process allows for utility involvement at various timeframes where early coordination can have a positive impact for both the LPA and the utilities. When applicable, early utility involvement should also address bridge accommodations. As soon as possible, the LPA should schedule on-site meetings with the utilities to discuss potential conflicts and possible mitigations. Relocation timeframes and construction or right-of-way constraints impacting utility relocation. This is the point in the plan development process where design changes can easily be made to minimize or eliminate utility involvement in the project. Again, when you're talking about timeframes, from an environmental perspective, we're talking about issues involving the Indiana BAT, or from a well, not so much from a utility perspective, we're talking about identifying utility conflicts that could possibly be a problem. In other words, ordering materials for the utility to have to relocate, or a splicing issue, which could be time frame constraints. So these are things that when we're developing, as we're going through the PDP, these are things that we want to look for in order to minimize the impact on the utilities. Part of the process, at this point, I don't know if many people are aware of, but OOPS, Ohio Utility Protection Service, is now known as Ohio 811. So Ohio is now a one-call state, and the utility is required by law to respond to utility requests and provide location information. It is the responsibility of the utility owner to cooperate in locating their existing underground facilities. The underground facilities are assigned specific colors for field markings, and depending on the terrain, you'll see flags and or painted designating the horizontal location of the utility. So as you can see here, in this case, you got not only the markings, but you also got flags shown here, and which is good, because if by chance some of these flags happen to disappear for whatever reason, there are still the markings out there for anybody surveying folks to go out there and gather up the information for the designer. So when it comes to protecting underground utility facilities during construction of a public improvement project, ORC 154.64 requires that all existing underground utilities must be shown on highway construction plans where excavation or ground penetration will occur. So based on that, how does the utility provide this information to the designer? They can be provided with a digital or paper plan drawn to scale depicting the location of the underground facility to the designer, or the utilities, either they go out or they have their contract people go out and mark the location of the underground facilities within the construction area in the field in accordance with the marking standards for retrieval by the engineer. And the last thing is a utility is only required to provide approximate location for underground facilities, and that's by the law. So when a designer is looking to gather this information is what is, from a utility perspective, required by law. But sometimes there's information that is needed that's more critical. In other words, not just saying, okay, I think that my facilities is 3 feet deep or 5 feet deep. It's more like, well, we really need to know how deep that is, because it's a critical factor in knowing whether or not a utility may have to move for certain, or whether they can stay in place. And what comes into play here is what we call subsurface utility engineering, or the acronym SUE. And SUE can be defined as the engineering process that accurately and comprehensively identify, characterize, and map underground utility facilities. So this information is good to get, because sometimes from a utility perspective, if they have to go out there and mark the facilities, it may be later on during the process. Whereas if a SUE provider is issued to go out there and gather this information, this can be done at an earlier stage, specifically during preliminary engineering or at the inception of stage 1 project development. And it's at this time to consider the use of SUE to be used to provide quality information on the locations of underground facilities and improve the accuracy of the design process. Now, states have recognized the SUE process can provide benefits, such as improves contract bid process, provides high quality information, and reduces utility damage. substantial cost savings, reduces cost overruns, and minimize change orders and contractors' claims. Now, how does SUE do this? Well, the SUE process itself, there are 4 utility data quality levels of information that establishes the different methods of data collection and interpretation. And each level provides information from the basic utility location to precise utility location. So SUE, I mean, for the most part, when SUE is used, it's probably not so much on projects in the rural areas as much as it's important use for projects in urbanized area. So when the SUE is used, usually you're looking at quality level B to gather information. In essence, what you're getting there is information that provides, better information than you would if the utility were to go out there and market. In other words, they'll not only be able to locate where these utilities are and market, but also, or gather the information from them, but also if there are unknown utilities out there. It's very important because sometimes in these projects that are being affected, the utilities may have lines that are basically abandoned. And sometimes from a contract perspective, knowing that they're abandoned for sure or not makes a difference between hitting something that may be live versus knowing that it is abandoned and it's not live. That can make the difference between an accident happening and not happening. And also at the same time, that information can be gathered electronically, put into the plans and into the CAD system based on the information that's put there by the SUE provider. But the best part about this and using SUE is the fact that you got a quality level A that not only does the horizontal, but also gives you a precise utility relocation of where the actual depth of that utility is. And that is good critical information when you're looking at utility conflicts to understand, well, this can be the difference between the utility having to move and not having to move. And knowing that, or for whatever, in any way, shape, or form, the installation of something, whether it forces the utility to move or not move. So again, quality level A, the SUE is a very good tool to use in helping to design the plans. The unfortunate part, as you're using to get more precise information, quality level A, there are costs involved, and that way, and you got to kind of balance the act on that between, what's important to use to find out precision locations versus, well, just give me the overall understanding of where the utilities are within the plans. If you're using quality level A, I'm not sure some people have seen it, but you basically got a hydrovac truck over here that's going to have a suction line and return line in essence. So when you're out there doing the SUE, you got the suction line, return line here, and this is tool the man's holding right here is basically no more different than your pressure washer that you have at home. It's just pressured water going in, hitting the ground, the dirt, and moving the soil out as if you're digging, so to speak. And what this individual doing is sucking out all the water, the dirt, the rocks, the grass, and all that stuff out of there. And then once they locate that facility underground, they go ahead and measure it. And then once that's measured, they turn around then and have a precise depth of where that location is. Some other things that are important from a real estate involvement in utility relocation is the right-of-way acquisition. Now, I've got a couple of things here. Acquisition of right-of-way for utility it's to provide utilities to relocate must be considered when accommodate utilities in the new proposed right-of-way. In essence, if when the plans for designing the project also needs to be kept in mind that utilities may be affected by this project as well. So if the project is let's say to add a turn lane, or to move a ditch over, the real true requirements may only be, well, if we only need 5 feet to do that, that's all we're going to buy is 5 feet for the project. But the consideration of utilities involved with that, you always want to take that into consideration. Well, if you're moving something over 5 feet, is what's left over, what we're requiring, is that going to be able to handle the utilities when they go to relocate? Maybe you may have to acquire an additional 5 feet more. So instead of 5 feet, it would be a total of 10 feet. So that way utilities have enough room to relocate their facilities. So these are done early on into the game, and it should always be something to think about as you design the project with the utilities in mind. Acquisition of an easement for utility. When acquiring an acquisition of an easement by an LPA on behalf of utility to relocate, and normally used when utility is unable to acquire the needed property right easement, by negotiating with the property owner. So sometimes there's a necessity that even though the utility can, go through and appropriate a property owner for additional right of way, they don't necessarily have the quick take authority. And you may run into situations where property owners may not want a utility to acquire additional easement from them. In that case, it's important then to know that either ODOT or the LPA has that ability to acquire the easement for the utility. And that's done basically, if the property owner says, no, I'm not going to sell to you, then if ODOT or the LPA goes out there and negotiate, they could say, well, that's fine, probably end up going through appropriation. And because of the ability of the government agent to have quick take, just deposit the money into the courts. And then from there, the utilities will then have the access rights to go ahead and enter onto that, to the new easement that's going to be acquired in their name. So these are things that are tools to always look at on these projects in order with utilities, in order to keep them on time with the schedules, and making sure that we have enough time to have them relocate on projects that we have them in order to get them to move. I want to kind of talk a little bit about programmatic agreement. There is a programmatic agreement that is between ODOT and FHWA. And the programmatic agreement, basically, it puts all federal oversight review on ODOT central office utilities to review and approve all reimbursable utility relocations prior to any authorization granted to the utility. So in essence, the state acts as a approving authority for FHWA. And then also it assures FHWA that this, based on the manual, the ODOT manual, based on federal guidelines, based on state guidelines, and we're gonna follow the book, as outlined, and assure that there's not going to be like 12 different districts reviewing and approving it. It's going to be done through central office, so it's going to be done on a that the statewide continuity of how these reimbursements are going to be reviewed and applied follow, what FHWA considers to be the proper procedures and everything that they would require us to do. And in essence, what this does then is it had eliminated what we used to have was a utility agreement. So that being said, what used to be a utility agreement that we would have when using federal dollars to be signed each and every time on a per project basis, that's been eliminated. Now, from a LPA perspective, I can't be honestly say sure how if that's still being applied there or not, but that's something that we here in Central Office did eliminate. However, I will say this. Back about in 2010, we decided to go to here at ODOT with what we call a Master Utility Reimbursement Agreement. So instead of it being on a per project basis like the utility agreement was established for, we now have agreements that basically says for each individual utility that whatever reimbursable projects that occur that based on that agreement, we don't have to get them to sign every individual utility agreement. It's just a perpetual agreement for all reimbursables for that particular utility. So when we come to relocation plans and estimates, eventually it's going to be determined that a utility is going to be in a reimbursable position. And when that occurs, the utility is responsible for sending in a preliminary estimate package. And within the package, there's going to be an RE75-1 form, and this form allows utilities to properly separate all charges associated with the utility relocation. They're also going to be sending in a relocation plan. And the relocation plan is going to detail the existing and proposed facilities. And an acceptable utility relocation plan clearly represents existing facilities to be removed, replaced, relocate, where the tie-ins are, what are going to remain in place, and any new facilities to be installed. Now, how the facilities are referenced to highway stations and offsets, we also want them to be represented and showed on the plan. Any type of appropriate profiles and or cross sections should be included as well. And color coding or other distinguishing identification should be used along with the showing and sizes of both existing and proposed facilities. So we definitely want as much information as possible on the plan so we can identify what facilities are being affected by the project, how much of it is, and what's going to be reimbursed. There's also the property rights. Whenever a utility is claiming reimbursements, a copy of those property rights needs to be submitted as well with the package. A bill of material must be provided that shows the description, quantity, and unit cost and total cost. And this is information that needs to be supplied during the preliminary estimate and with the RE75-1. It's important also, when a utility contractor, when the construction work for the utility is being done, it can be done either by the utility and or by a utility contractor. And important to understand that there are two types of ways that we look at this. If the utility chooses to use a continuing contract, then it's important to have a copy of the contract and rate structure be submitted to ODOT to be kept on file. And if the utility chooses to use a bid proposal, and a copy of all the bids, the lowest bid being accepted, will need to be submitted to ODOT at the preliminary estimate or prior to the utility releasing the construction work to the lowest bidder. Now, there are other pertinent information such as a betterment or salvage material that needs to be properly determined at the estimate stage. These items must be supported at the time of the estimate submission in order to verify the relationship of the cost to the proposed utility relocation. So in essence, verify that at the estimate cost. Okay, let's say the betterment's going to be $1,000, determined to be $1,000 at the estimate cost. Well, when the final bill in the RE 75-2, that package is turned in, we should be able to verify whether the $1,000 is accurate, or it could be $1,500, it could be $500. So we have a comparison to look at as far as of how that those costs are determined. The other thing, Buy America, and Buy America applies when the utility reimbursement for ODOT projects are funded under Title 23 of the U.S. Code. In essence, on our form, the 75-1 and the 75-2, there's a box on the form that needs to be checked. And if that box is not checked, then ODOT cannot process utility billing for final payment. That's just how that process works on that. And it is approval letter. It is critical for the utility to have received proper authorization and approval by letter from ODOT to perform the construction relocation work. Any utility relocation work performed prior to review and approval of the plan and estimate can be considered ineligible for state and or federal reimbursement. So it's essential that that approval letter is given to the utility, and that any construction work shall be performed either on the date of that approval letter or after the date of the approval letter. And as far as with monitoring utility costs, that's essential that the utility monitor the cost during the construction phase in case problems occur during the construction that may add cost to the relocation work. So any type of cost increase in the estimate basically requires written or verbal approval by ODOT before the work related to the cost increase can be performed. So this includes any cost increase to the estimate that is created as a result of the change in the project scope. ODOT will determine if the revised RE 75-1 is needed. Now, any change in the project scope must be approved and coordinated with the district utility coordinator to keep the project on schedule and eligible for reimbursement. So if ODOT is not notified of the changes, then this may be deemed unapproved relocation work and ineligible for reimbursement. So in other words, all utilities, once that estimate is submitted, that amount of money is going to be encumbered for when that billing arrives. Now, it's hard if the utility is not monitoring the project and their costs, then in the end, the only notification that may be given is the final billing. So if the estimate was for $100,000 and the final billing comes in at $200,000, it's going to be a big question mark to say, what happened? And based on that, you got to look at it and say, okay, did you notify ODOT that this work, that you were running into problems? And if the answer is no, the question is why not? So in essence, we're going to be requiring a overrun letter to explain these things. But the point of all this is if a utility is monitoring their project and they run into problems out into the field, they need to immediately get a hold of the LPA or the, in our case, the district coordinator, and say, hey, we got problems out there. And the costs are going to increase by another $50,000 or whatever. Well, we're not going to say to the utility company, no, just wait till you hear back from us. We're going to ask them to continue on, but follow up on on possibly having to resubmit a new revised estimate. But in the meantime, continue the work so that way then it keeps in flow with the time frame for the schedule of our project to be met. So that is an important step to always remind utilities of this process and how it works. So that way then there's no surprises in the end and on the final billing. So kind of getting out to the part where how do you determine utility reimbursement eligibility? So what we're saying here is what part is going to be the responsibility of ODOT and what part's going to be the responsibility of the utility cost-wise in this reimbursement. So first of all, you got to look at it from, again, we've already talked about it, based on existing facilities affected, which is based on, if you're talking about poles, it's based on removed, replaced, or relocate. In other words, aerial facilities. If we're talking about underground facilities, it's based on the affected footage, which means from tie-in point to tie-in point. In the end, it's calculated as a ratio of what is eligible or ineligible percentage rounded off to the second decimal. And it's applied to the total cost of the relocation. Now, that being said, we're going to go and look at a basic example of what we're trying to say here. So in this case, this example, we're trying to calculate the aerial facilities here, and these dots here basically are poles. And down here, we're trying to calculate underground facilities, and as you see here, this is the underground facility of the gas line. So based on that, what's existing? Well, let's count them. Right now, what's existing is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. There's 7 poles that are affected by the project. As you can see, of the 7 poles, 3 poles, ones in green, are in an easement, and the ones in red are in the road right-of-way. So in order to calculate the percentage of participation, you just do simple division. 3 poles divided by 7, the ones that are in easement, is going to be what ODOT's going to pay. So that's 42.86%. The 4 that are not eligible, which are in the road right-of-way by permit, are going to be what the utility costs and responsibility are. So 4 out of 7 is 57.14%. That's how the percent of participations is calculated. It's just whatever is reimbursable and whatever is not reimbursable. When you're looking at underground facilities, in this particular case, this line right here, as we're seeing, there was 1,069 feet of it. Of that 1,069 feet, there was down here, what's in green, 592 feet is eligible, and 477 feet, what's in red here, is ineligible. And we're looking at it based on, again, here is the eligibility, and once it crosses over between the right-of-way line between what's in the road and what's outside the road, is where that determination stops at. So this, just like I said, it's a simple little example here, but in the end, the things that you also need to understand that and I want to emphasize here is that this determination of what is eligible and what is not eligible is determined here at the estimate stage. Whatever this percentage is, regardless of if the proposed work, instead of, well, in this case, you're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 poles here, but in actuality, it could be 7. It could be 8, it could be 9 poles out here. Regardless, whatever, we don't calculate the percent of participation in the proposed. It's always considered in the existing. So this information would then be carried over. What's in the estimate would be carried over into the RE75-2, the billing side of things as well. So it may be a lot more cost involved here, but the percentage, on the relocation side of it, but the percentage of participation is going to remain the same, whether it's for aerial or for underground facilities. All right, just kind of a little bit more continuation here. It's not a good idea to combine unlike facilities unless both facilities are 100% reimbursable. That's what we're talking about. Sometimes you're going to see aerial and underground facilities. You're going to have distribution and transmission. Typically, these submissions of these billings are going to have different percent of participations. Unless they're 100%, they need to be separate submissions of estimates to be evaluated. Personally, I think regardless if it's 100% reimbursable, separating them out is the best way to do it, to be honest with you. Don't include affected facilities beyond the project limits as part of the eligible percentage of participation. In essence, what it's saying here is that if you may have facilities, the affected facilities, or you may have facilities outside the project limits that are affected by this project. You may have to go, maybe 1 or 2 poles down the line there that are affected by the project, but are not within the project limits. The cost that the additional poles that need to be replaced and or whatever, installed, can be added to the estimate, but the percent of participation, you cannot use those poles as part of the percent of participation count. So it's important to understand that as well. Don't include guy or stub poles unless they're energized in the calculation of the percentage of participation. That's just part of the process and rules. And when you're looking at, in the end, after everything is constructed, we're going to get a billing invoice from the utilities, and what we want to do is make sure that the summary of billing package, the bill is checked for mathematical accuracy, supporting all the documentation and proofs of payment are included, assuring that the work was performed in accordance with the approved plan and estimate. It confirms the start and completion dates, and that's important to look at when it comes to the construction, relocation work. And if the reimbursement amount in the bill is more than 10% over the amount in the approved estimate, an explanation of the cost overrun must be provided with the bill. Now, based on that, when the utility submits the billing package we're going to see the RE75-1 form, and this form allows the utility to properly separate all charges associated with the bill. We're also going to see a utility construction start date. Now that's an important thing to know about, because utilities cannot start their relocation work until they get an approval letter sent to them. Now, this can be done by the, from the LPA, may the coordinator, but bottom line is on this, if this relocation work is started prior to the approval letter date, then that could be determined to be as ineligible charges. Typically, what happens is a utility may send in all their charges, and when I'm talking about like their preliminary engineering work, their right-of-way costs, or sometimes even unapproved costs, they may submit it on an earlier date prior to the approval letter date, and they roll it all together, and then that becomes confusing, because when a person looks at that, they say, well, did you actually start the relocation work prior to the approval letter or not? So it's important to remind and verify that the costs shown on the utility where they do the permanent construction work, that those dates where they are actually physically out there relocating the facilities do not occur until on or after the approval letter date. So provide the documentation to support the billing. Basically, the utility needs to provide detailed sheets giving the breakdown as to dates, quantities, rates, the amount of each individual item of labor, material, and equipment, etc. I mean, the final billing invoice has to be clearly itemized and include documentation to support costs that's contained on the invoice, such as job cost reports, subcontractor invoices, material invoices, or any other documentation deemed necessary, by ODOT or the LPA. And when we're talking about actual cost versus estimated cost, the final billing should be reasonably close to the dollar amount of the estimate. I mean, if the amount of the billing is substantially more than the estimate, which greater than 10%, the utility documentation associated with the ODOT being notified of the increase must be added to the billing package. In other words, any major deviation from the approved plan and estimate must be clearly explained, properly supported, and approved. And that's for this reason, it's essential that the utility monitor all their costs during the construction phase in case problems occur during the construction that will add to the cost of the relocation work in excess of the 10% overrun. And the other thing, it's a good important understanding that an overrun letter is required to justify approved additional work above the estimate. An overrun letter would not suffice for unapproved work above the estimate. So there is a difference when an overrun letter is used. Utility should always supply an overrun, but the justification part is going to be determined on whether or not the additional work, it comes about because of the fact that a good example might be if a utility left out, let's say in their estimate, they provided all the information that's needed, but they left out something along the lines of maybe any cost for general overheads. Well, that cost of that, and then when the final billing comes in, they have overhead costs included in there. And, overhead cost ranges from a few $1,000s to could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, that difference could be the difference as far as why the estimate and the final billing don't match up. So you got to look at things of that nature to verify that, are they justifiable costs, or Was this work that was just because, well, the utility just wanted to do the work for whatever reason? You know, that would be more considered unapproved work. There also are some inappropriate expenditures, and these are costs like associated with what they call AFUDC, which is like allowance for funds used during construction, or Ohio sales tax, or betterments, overtime, things of that nature. Those would be inappropriate expenditures to send in for payment. Now, the final billing submittal. The final invoice for all reimbursement work must be submitted within 1 year of the completion of the said relocation work or risk forfeiture of reimbursement. But there are, you know, if the utility provides written, you know, saying, hey, you know what, we know we're a little bit late on this and getting this to you, but we promise we want to get this in within the next, you know, as long as there's some type of notification that they are going to be getting in that reimbursement into for payment soon, then, you know, we would allow for a time extension on that. But at ODOT here, we're being more proactive in reminding those utilities that it's important to get these bills in. And by proactive, you know, this office works with the utility coordinators and providing them information to help update utilities every 2 months to say, hey, you know, we haven't seen your utility bill come in yet. You know, just reminder, please, please send it in as soon as you can. And then, you know, when it reaches that point of level where, you know, we say, hey, 90 days prior to the year, we're going to send you a 90-day letter saying, look, you know, you got 90 days to get this in or forfeit, you know, risk forfeiting your payment. And then if there's still no response, then, you know, after when the year time comes for him, you know, where they're going to be receiving a letter that says, you know, sorry about, but we can't, you know, the funds, we cannot pay based on the fact that you needed to have gotten this information in within a year's time frame. Now, this is for basically on everybody's part. I mean, after a year's time, you know, the expectation is the utility should be able to submit a final billing, but also because of budgets and everything else that we have going on our plans, we can't just, you know, wait and wait forever for the utility to submit a final billing. And then last on this is all utility relocation reimbursement are subject to state and federal audit for 3 years subsequent to receipt of final payment by the utility. All right, so at this point, I want to kind of go over some things. With ODOT involvement when we administer projects for the LPA, under a local or an ODOT-let scenario case, there is legislation between the LPA and ODOT that must clearly define responsibilities between each party. Yeah, so in essence, ODOT's policy for ODOT-let projects, the legislative agreement executed between ODOT and the LPA must clearly define the responsibilities, including the handling of utility relocation. So it's important that all utility adjustments or relocation conform to policies and procedures set forth in the ODOT Utilities Manual. The amount of ODOT oversight involvement may vary with the district. So from an ODOT perspective, everything of this nature is kind of run through central office. For the LPA, it's kind of ran through the districts. So how the involvement with these things are accomplished, I mean, whether or not with the district utility coordinator or the LPA coordinator, this type of information is different at each district. I just wanted to kind of point that out when working with utilities and the reimbursement. So again, for right-of-way costs including utility relocation costs, since the LPA is the responsible agent, they need to be made aware up front that the obligation concerning the utility approval and cost obligation. It's important that the LPA understands that the right-of-way costs include eligible utility costs, and these costs are typically paid at 100% by the LPA. Again, the LPA will review and approve the submitted utility plan and estimate package for reimbursement and then forward it to the district for approval. Now, under this process with ODOT-let, when it comes to the reimbursing of the utilities, it's typically handled in our traditional way where it'll go to the district or the LPA will review the plans and estimates, and then they'll forward it to the district. Well, the district in turn will have given it for our district utility coordinator to review. And then once they review, they say, okay, well, we're sending it up to central office utility to get them for their review and approval. Once it gets to central office, at this point, we're going to look at it and say, okay, yeah, everything's fine. Based on the estimate, there's going to be a certain percentage there where the LPA is going to be responsible for the payment, or and then we'll here at ODOT encumber those funds at this particular point to make sure that when the bill comes in, there's going to be the funds there available to pay the bill. And then once we approve it and encumber the funds, then we let the district know what's going on, and then they in turn will send it to the LPA, and the LPA will send out that approval letter stating that in essence you're good to go. Utilities go ahead and do the reimbursement, and in so doing, the funds are going to be made available for when you submit the final billing in for payment. Now, it's important too, the depositing of monies versus direct payment by the LPA. The LPA has an obligation to deposit monies with the state for payment of all utility relocations not eligible for FHWA participation. So once the encumbrance is set up based on the LPA percent of participation, it's going to be on the RE 75-1. Otherwise, the LPA should notify the district utility office in writing that utility costs will be paid directly by the LPA. So there are two different ways of doing that. The LPA is responsible for depositing funds covering utility work not eligible for project participation. So if the LPA cannot deposit their obligated funds for all utility relocation costs, then the ODOT Division of Finance will bill the LPA the remaining reimbursements balance at the project closeout. So in this case too, the LPA coordinator, whoever that might be, will prepare a utility note and provide it to the district real estate administrator so that it can be handled or included in the right-of-way certification letter. And the district utility coordinator will post a note on ODOT's O-Drive at the plan package submittal date. And also, the LPA will review and approve the submitted final billing package for reimbursement and then forward to the district for review. The district will review and send the final billing to central office utility for review and approval. Once it's approved by central office utilities, the encumbered funds and any additional funds needed to satisfy the utility final billing will be used to pay the final utility billing invoice. And the final billing is processed by central office utility. And it is the LPA's responsibility to make sure all utility relocation activities are performed as needed to assure the highway project is constructed in a timely manner. So the costs associated with the construction delays caused by the utility are the responsibility of the LPA, and the LPA should then determine whether or not to seek restitution from the utility. I think this is our last slide on the presentation. When we're talking about also local-let projects, so in accordance with ODOT's policy for local-let projects, the project agreement executed between ODOT and the LPA must clearly define the responsibilities of each party, including the handling of utility relocations. So it's important that all utility adjustments or relocations conform to policies and procedures set forth in the ODOT Utilities Manual. And it is the LPA's responsibility to review and approve all utility relocation plans, estimates, and billings for reimbursement. And the LPA must demonstrate it has proper mechanisms in place to successfully administer a local-let project. And then ODOT actually is ultimately responsible for the spending of federal dollars and must assure local compliance with all federal and state laws. The district utility coordinator is available to provide guidance to the LPA regarding utility relocation, but it is the LPA's responsibility to make sure all utility relocation activities are performed as needed and to ensure that the highway project is constructed in a timely manner. And the utility note is written by the LPA and a copy is inserted with the plan package when it is filed. So at this point, that's pretty much everything in the presentation. And Victoria, if there's anybody still left out there listening, I'll open it up to questions.
Mark, there's actually 100 people that are still out there, but
Oh Lord,
since we're like,
don't you guys got anything better to do?
oh, they're just enthralled by the information you've shared.
Yeah, and that's
And
way
I
too
have
much.
a number of questions, but I tell you, we're already 7 minutes over. So what we're
Okay.
going to do is we're just going to provide the questions to Mark so he can give you answers in writing. And then once that is completed, I'll email that out along with a copy of Mark's PowerPoint and hopefully a link to the recording to everybody. So thank you so much for your time today, Mark. This has been a great webinar, and I know that everyone has gotten a lot of information from it.
Okay, I just want to say one last thing here too, for all those out there. If there's any questions or anything that you have, you're more than free to contact myself or Wendy Snyder, and we'll hopefully be able to get back with you and give you all the information that you need. But appreciate you, everyone, taking the time out for this webinar, and I hope there was some information that will be useful for everyone.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and end things now. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.